Well, you had to wait quite a while. I mean, I see a very enthusiastic public audience here, and I'm happy you all came. Thank you very much. We welcome you on behalf of the board of our John Adams Institute. By now, you all know what the Institute is and what we stand for. We also welcome, of course, our guest, Mary Gordon, and Mr. Martin and Hart. Two people, two writers you all know. I need my glasses now. Well, so far our audiences have met famous authors like Saul Bellow, Alice Walker, John Irving, Paul Theroux, Lisa Alter, Kosinski, who passed away 2 weeks ago, I think. Next year we will have some very good new writers to come, and we hope you will all keep being a faithful audience to us. Mary Gordon from New York. She lectures at Barnard College. She is now in Europe on an American arts speakers tour. This tour started in Paris, crossed Eastern European countries, and will end tomorrow in Brussels. Mrs. Gordon will be introduced by Martin Hart, who doesn't need any further introduction. I hope you will, after the intermission, you will all come up with good and fun questions that we will get a nice, lively discussion. Around 9 o'clock this intermission will be there, and after the intermission then Mr. Uthart will open the discussion. And then, of course, you get the opportunity to ask the questions. Thank you very much for coming here. Thank you.
Well, I hope you understand my broken English. I'm very glad that I'm asked to introduce Mary Gordon to you. She was born in 1949. Is that right? That's right. Thank you. On Long Island. Is that right? That's right. Ah, yes. Grew up in an intensely Catholic neighborhood in Queens, in New York, and was educated at Barnard College. She comes from a background that is part Catholic, but also part Jewish. Her mother was a Catholic of Irish descent. That's all right? Yes. Right. Her father, who died when Mary Gordon was 8, was a Jew from Ohio who converted to Catholicism in the 1930s. One of the interesting points about Mary Gordon is that her Catholic upbringing has a very marked effect on everything she has written. She is not just a writer with a vague religious background. Neither is she a Catholic writer like Graham Greene or Evelyn Waugh, but there is a similarity to a Protestant background, and that's the reason I think that I'm invited to introduce her, because my very strict Calvinistic upbringing shines through everything I wrote. I have no affinity at all with real Catholic writers, because Catholicism is stranger for me than, let's say, Marxism or Mohammedanism. As a child, I was always told that Catholics are very dangerous. They are saving firewood in their back gardens, we were told, to put the Protestants on stake the moment they will have a majority in the country. Although I said farewell to Christianity, I'm still suspicious when I hear that somebody is Catholic, or, as we say, a papist. Do you say that also in papist? You don't know that word?
No,
Papist?
only the English say that about Catholics as a term of derision.
Ah, yeah, but it's not an American word. Even writers with a Catholic background I distrust. And there is always, when I, for instance, read James Joyce or Mary McCarthy, the feeling that they are talking about a completely different religion than the one that I'm familiar with. There is only one Catholic writer that gives me the feeling that he is talking about the same God and Jesus I grew up with, and that's Flannery O'Connor. The first time I saw the name of Mary Gordon was on the back of one of the most beautiful books I know, The Habit of Being, Letters of Flannery O'Connor. These letters Mary Gordon wrote are a treasure, funny, relentless, deeply touching. They reveal the mind of one of our least personal writers. From that moment on, the name of Mary Gordon stuck in my mind, and when I saw that she had written a novel herself, Final Payments, I at once read it. I think that Mary Gordon has strong affinities with Flannery O'Connor. That strange person Laura in Mary Gordon's third novel, Men and Angels, with her religious idiosyncrasies, comes straight, I think, from the world of Flannery O'Connor. But the world of Mary Gordon is not so nightmarish as the world of Flannery O'Connor. It seems to be difficult to call Flannery O'Connor a realist. But it's quite certain that Mary Gordon is a realist, what we call a realist. And I think that's the subject she will talk about this evening. So far, Mary Gordon wrote 4 novels and 1 book of short stories and a book of essays, she told me just now. Apart from the subject Catholicism as a forming and disfiguring influence, there are, I think, 2 very important themes she writes always about. The first theme is that strange phenomenon we all know, hate at first sight. You meet somebody, there is no reason to dislike him or her, but although that other person is really very nice and seems to like you, you are simply not able to like him or her. And because of that fact, you feel guilty. There is a short story of Mary Gordon in which she describes this phenomenon in a simple and very effective way. It's the story The Only Son of the Doctor. A woman loves a doctor, but when she meets his son for the first time, she hates him. She is simply not able to love him, and the son knows it. And what I think is very interesting about this story is the fact that the woman and the son talk about this hate at first sight. In her first book, Final Payments, Mary Gordon already explored this, let me call it, hate theme very extensively. Isabel, is that right, the right pronunciation? Isabel, the main character of the book, who tells her own story, hates Margaret Casey, the former housekeeper in her father's home. Isabel tries to love her. She tries it very hard. She even goes so far that she gives up her own job and own house to live with and care for that Margaret she hates so bitterly. That part of that wonderful book, Final Payments, is hard to swallow because it's very difficult to believe that you can do this, going to live with a person you hate because you feel guilty, and as a kind of a sacrifice. But when you are familiar with a strict religious upbringing, then you understand that part of the book instinctively. In Men and Angels, we find the same theme. Anne, the principal character, hates Laura, who is looking after Anne's children in a wonderful way. But she hates that Laura at first sight, and although Laura helps her and does a great job with her children, Anne simply cannot bring herself to even like Laura. Because of that hatred, the Anne-Laura relation ends with disaster, and Anne feels guilty. The same hate theme is also explored in The Company of Women. Take, for instance, just one simple sentence on page 48. Augustine, is told there, did not like Cyprian, and Cyprian knew it. And in Mary Gordon's last novel, The Other Side, a great novel about family relations, women are, in fact, driven with hate. That's a very interesting book because you never read about that kind of thing. You always read about women who love, but it is a book about women who hate. But in that last novel, Mary Gordon explores another theme that's very important in her work, old age. It's already there in Final Payments. In that book, Isabel gets a job. What she has to do is to interview people who look after very old persons they took into their homes to earn some money. There's one beautiful scene in the book. Isabel is interviewing a very old man, and he asks her one favor. May he just see her bosom? After some hesitation, she grants him that favor. that's a marvelous part of the book. Very moving, funny and sad and tender. In the company of women, we meet an old priest, and in the other side, a very old Catholic woman. Ellen looks back. I think, I may venture a prediction, that old age theme will become more and more important in the work of Mary Gordon. There's just one other aspect in her work I would like to mention. Mary Gordon has something, and I don't know exactly what. After her talk, I hope to ask her about it, with shoes and boots. They are very important in her work. The black shoes of the priests in the first pages of Final Payments, and those black shoes are always recurring in her books. But not only shoes, there are a lot of boots in her work. Take, for instance, the story I told you about, the only son of the doctor. When the principal character of the story sees for the first time the son she is going to hate, Mary Gordon tells us, she followed behind Henry, stepping over his son's black boots. She hated those boots. There was something illegal looking about them. In Men and Angels, we are told that Anne, the principal character of the novel, is buying a pair of green leather boots, soft and low-heeled, like riding boots, except that the tops fall down. More than a whole page of the book is devoted to the description of this purchase. These green boots are never mentioned again. They play no role in the book, and as far as I can see, there is no reason at all for telling this story about purchasing green boots. It has no connection with the rest of the book. It's just there, I think, because of the fact that Mary Gordon has something with boots and shoes. In the company of women, we find this passage on page 38. And in fact, it begins on 37. It's about Felicitas, and there we are told she thought of the fat face of Khrushchev, the shining face of John F. Kennedy, the soft shoe of Nikita Khrushchev, the soft foreign shoe he banged on the table of the United Nations when he vowed to bury the Americans, the hard, expensive shoes of John F. Kennedy, the shoe with pinholes in the leather, wingtips they were called, which show he was a man, a girl was right to love. The shoes in her books has always something to do with love. And because of that fact, well, I never wear black shoes, but for this occasion I fetched black shoes from the attic of my house. I polished them painstakingly for half an hour, especially for this occasion, that I still have a black finger because of that. So that my shoes looked just like priest shoes, so that I thought maybe Mary Gordon wouldn't hate me at first sight. And now I think it's time to stop and to listen to Mary Gordon herself. Thank you.
Thank you. I sort of feel like the Imelda Marcos of literature. What I'm going to do tonight, and I really hope that I'll tell you the truth. I had two things that I could do tonight. You can actually vote if you like. I have one lecture about what's happening in American literature, just in general, from my point of view. Highly idiosyncratic, extremely prejudiced, personal and subjective. And then I have another lecture, which I think Martin referred to, which is about shoes in literature, and where you can get really good shoes in New York now that I. Miller's is closed. If you don't want to go to Maud-Free Zone, which is a little bit radical. But this was a lecture about what realism means for a woman writer. And what I thought was that probably you'd be more interested in hearing about what's happening in American literature in general than... See, that's exactly what they tell you not to do to your children. Don't give them a choice. So don't say you can have peanut butter and jelly or tuna fish. Just give them the tuna fish and they can go for it. So what do you want, the peanut butter and jelly or the tuna fish? Okay, how many people would like to hear about American literature in general? And how many people would like to hear about women in realism? Okay. All right. I'm very accommodating. Okay, this is called Whose Realism Is It Anyway? Where and When Women Enter. And because we're being a little bit informal, I think I should give you a little inside information about something about the genesis of this talk, at least in my psychology. As you may or may not know, Tom Wolfe, I guess about a year and a half ago, wrote a fairly obnoxious to deeply obnoxious article, depending upon how you feel about Tom Wolfe. And you'll be able to tell how I feel about him pretty soon, in which he said that the problem with American writing, except for him, he did not have this problem, which is why he was writing the article, was that it was unrealistic, that only he, in his great novel, Bonfire of the Vanities, was following the tradition of the marvelous 19th century novelists, particularly Zola, who seems to be the only one that he's read, and really regretting that great 20th century writers like Sinclair Lewis were not having any heirs. That only he, Tom Wolfe, was dealing with the complexity of urban life, and that the rest of us were solipsistic, self-indulgent, weak-minded, weak-kneed, academic, boring, and irrelevant, leaving the field clear for himself. And he and I got into some argument about this, both in print and on television, in which I discovered he'd never read Flaubert, because he didn't know the plot of A Simple Heart. That was a good moment. But I began to think that one of the reasons why his definition of realism was particularly unsatisfactory was that it was a male definition of realism, and that was very unsatisfactory. So this is my attempt to open up the definition. So it's called Whose Realism Is It Anyway? When and Where Women Enter. When we yoke the two words, women and realism, we begin with two words which in themselves are vexed, so we can hope for nothing less than a double vexation. I myself have no problem with the word woman, being one myself, but the word in its possessive case, women's, as in movement, literature, rights, seems to put a lot of people on edge. I, on the other hand, am put most definitely on edge by the word realism, which I think has a long and dishonorable tradition of being misleading. The problem with realism is its potential opposite. If some fiction is called realistic, what should we call that fiction which we describe as different from what we call realistic? Do we call it unrealistic fiction? Non-realistic fiction? This problem stems from the fact that to call something realistic assumes that we know what is real, or at least that we know that the question, what is real, is an answerable one. Those who hold themselves up as people in charge of the aesthetic of realistic fiction would probably think of any such question, how can we know what is real, as a symptom of exactly the problem they're trying to combat, a tendency toward relativistic fuzzy thinking that only creates problems, alienates the common people, and makes life no fun. It occurs to me that what most speakers mean when they say realism is materialism, or more properly, the observation of the material world as it is shaped or defined by money, war, and heterosexual sex from a male point of view. The paradox of this is, to me, that nothing is less real than money, in the sense of its being insubstantial. Money has no body. Its value is purely symbolic, and our world holds together because of the frighteningly fragile shared fantasy that bars of metal are really food, clothing, and shelter. When I have in my life, and it isn't often, tried to read economics, I've had to give it up quickly because it seems so unreal to me. And the unreality of something that has such an impact on my daily life, that is to say, what my children and I are buying, whether my children and I are hungry or full, warm or cold, sheltered or without shelter, naked or clothed, is truly terrifying to me. These kinds of thoughts, for example, parabolic curves in supply-side economics, make the most abstract of Borges's ficciones seem as solid as Trollope to me. Tom Wolfe recently, or perhaps not so recently now, accused the fiction writers of America of deservedly losing our audience, an audience he was happy to say he had at the tip of his fingers. Because we, unlike him, it was not only implied but stated, had turned our back on the important stuff of fiction, by which he meant precisely money and its human enactment, social status. Every human interaction, according to Tom Wolfe, is based on calculations of social status. When I asked him if relations between parents and children fell under this heading, he said yes. For him, anyone who doesn't focus his or her attention on this truth walks around in a befuddled cloud, has his or her feet not touching the same sidewalk that Tom Wolfe is convinced he owns. The other charge leveled against American writers by Wolfe, and this is a more difficult one to be flippant about, but I'll try, is that we haven't come fictionally to grips with the major event of our generation, the Vietnam War. Now, I haven't noticed Tom Wolfe's characters stepping out of choppers on the Mekong Delta, but then they probably wouldn't. It's so hard to figure out what kind of shoes go well with camouflage outfits. Nevertheless, although the temptation to put Tom Wolfe at the center of this argument is great, I feel honor-bound to resist it, if only because he puts so much time putting himself there, and one hates to duplicate a job already so well done, particularly in this age of high unemployment. But the reason that there has been so little successfully written about Vietnam, although it's not true that no one has done it, only that no one seems to have done it definitively, is because the experience of fighting this war seemed so surreal to those who fought it, often as they fought it in a drug-induced haze. By suggesting that what is required is a recreation of the very war that marked the transition to the postmodern era, a recreation in the terms of the 19th century, creates problems that are impossible for a writer. One of the most important criteria for realism, it would seem, is an apt understanding of the limitations of realism and the limitations of the realistic novel. That is to say, a long narrative with a thick line down the middle may be inappropriate to the experience of Vietnam. That is not to say that the experience of Vietnam cannot be recorded in a long fictive work between two bound covers. But the form best suited to it may be a fragmentary one, reflecting the tone of the real experience. That which happened was self-contradictory, paradoxical, and unknowable as a whole. That the serious writer may feel the inadequacy of the sentences and the structure of the realistic novel and be searching for the form or language in which to place the unbelievable experience of Vietnam in the way that for Garcia Marquez in his magic realism is the natural expression of the incomprehensible and surreal texture in Latin America under the role of the dictators is something that we need to consider. In other words, that, as Virginia Woolf would say, the Shakespeare sister of Vietnam has yet to be born because the form has yet to be invented. And it may be possible that in our age, the novel is not the right form for describing the Vietnam War. That film, which assumes fragmentary, partial, and overlapping visions, may be more appropriate for giving us the texture and the sense of the war as a whole. Francis Ford Coppola, of course, failed in his attempt to do it on a grand scale in Apocalypse Now. But perhaps at least one of the reasons why he failed was because he had the model of Conrad in his mind. More successful fictions about Vietnam, Full Metal Jacket, Platoon, Born on the 4th of July, succeeded better because their focus was smaller and they resisted precisely the 19th century realistic attempt to give us what could be called the big or the whole picture. I don't want to close the door on the novel as a possible vehicle for the expression of modern war, because the genius of the novel is its flexibility. But I only want to suggest that when the correct novelistic form is found for the experience of modern war, it won't be one that attempts to give the large picture, and it will be one that presses the unreality of war, suggested by Heller's Catch-22, even further, more perhaps in the direction of poetry. So that if what Tom Wolfe is worried about is the fact that we haven't produced the From Here to Eternity of Vietnam, I say what my European friends seem to think Americans spend our whole lives saying, no problem. Woolf's other complaint about the failure of realistic fiction is that it fails to record the complex hum and buzz of modern urban life. The novel, that is, he says, except for his. He assumes that his inclusion of black low-lives and their manipulative demagogues, and the manipulative demagogues they bring out of the woodwork, is opening the door on the real life of African Americans, telling us something that we haven't heard and really need to know. For the black community, this is merely another act of racism committed in the name of realism, another imperialistic rout crowned with the features of self-congratulation. See, folks, I include you in my story. Aren't you lucky? You're here. I must be telling the truth. But it's useful to note that in his catalog of the American writers, brought up largely for the purpose of comparing himself favorably to them, Tom Wolfe doesn't mention some of the truly luminous work that is shedding genuine light on American cultural diversity. His catalog of American writers leaves out the names, among many, of Louise Erdrich, Maxine Hong Kingston, and Toni Morrison. It may not be an accident that these three are women. I don't know. But in the work of these three women, and particularly of Toni Morrison, on whom I wish to focus, we have, it seems to me, a way into realism that is neither nostalgic nor delusional. Certainly, these women write in the realistic tradition, but it is a tradition that includes the poetry of the Latin Americans' magic realism, as well as the psychological acuity learned from the real masters of realism, Flaubert, Chekhov, and Dostoevsky. The mention of the name Dostoevsky gives me an excuse for a small aside in which I hope you will indulge me. Dostoevsky wrote at a time of enormous political upheaval in Russia. Yet he didn't choose to write a novel which centers itself, for example, on the liberation of the serfs. And his concentration on the inner psychological and spiritual states of his tormented characters earned him in his own day the reputation among critics as being unrealistic. he was criticized for focusing on characters' inner lives instead of the daily problems that went on around him in contemporary Russia. To return to Kingston, Erdrich, and Morrison, however, it seems to me that these three women have taken important steps toward the handling of the problem of realism in a way that is realistic, given the fragmented nature of our age. They have returned the novel to its sources in the tale, including thereby many of the structures and devices of plain story. And they give us a real and fresh look into the lives of characters, many of them only known to us as caricatures beforehand, the kind of caricature Tom Wolfe did nothing but perpetuate. The language that these women use is poetic, rich, dreamy, and embodied. And this is precisely, and this body, particularly the female body, is exactly the site where ideas of realism for men and women begin to diverge. The body, in the fiction of most white American males, is the fighting body, the money-earning body, the body of the penetrating phallus. Rarely is it the paternal body. When paternity enters into American fiction, it has to do with legacy, expectation, and disappointment and control. Neither the physical care that the child's body requires, nor the amazingly powerful, almost erotic bodily response evoked by children have found their way into the work of American male writers. You may invoke the name of John Irving in The World According to Garp, but nowhere in that book do the bodies of children call up the obsessive love that they do, for example, in the work of Toni Morrison. In the fiction of American male writers, the body is never an eating body. An interesting doctoral dissertation might be done on the attention given to money by male writers versus the attention given to food by female writers. And although at least male and female writers, at least the heterosexual ones, share an interest in heterosexual sex, the place of sex and what constitutes desire are very different for male and female writers, at least in part, because for most male writers, phallic life is the only body life that enters fiction, so it takes on a disproportionate importance. I'd like to talk about Toni Morrison's Beloved and examine how her work roots itself in the body and in poetry. That she creates a real realism that takes in not only the seen world, but the unseen world as well. Beloved is a book that either is or is not about a ghost. Or actually, it definitely includes one ghost, and one of its leading characters may or may not be a ghost. So there's at least one ghost, and it's up for grabs whether or not there are two. What it really is a novel about slavery, with as many horrifying details about the physical oppression of slavery as any neo-Zolaist could call for. But some of the details both retain their physical veracity and are raised to a grim poetry as well, as in the case of Setha's Back. The novel Beloved is set in the time of slavery, and Setha, its leading character, is a female slave who is raped by 3 white men while she is pregnant with one child and nursing a second. The true violation of Setha is that the 3 white boys not only rape her in the conventional sense, they steal the milk from her lactating breasts, degrading her triply, first by invading her body, second by milking her as if she were a cow, that is to say an animal, and third, by stealing that which properly belongs to her child. And it is this theft of that which properly belongs to her child that Setha can and will not forgive. After these 3 boys, watched over by an older man, have performed this triple violation, they whip Setha on the back brutally. The scars grow, however, into the pattern of a chokecherry tree, which Paul D., her lover, on kissing her 20 years later, describes as, quote, a pattern put there by a workman too passionate for display, unquote. After the original violation, Sethe arranges for the escape of her children and then escapes from slavery herself, giving birth in the woods in a harrowingly described section that invokes the tearing and searing pain of childbirth and the ecstatic quiet afterwards. In the history of fiction that purports to be realistic, there is a notable silence on what is arguably one of the most real experiences in life, that is to say, birth, the other perhaps being death. Sethe is helped in the woods by a runaway white girl, half witch, half healer, half part madwoman, who is planning on walking from Kentucky to Boston, and that's probably about 1,000 miles. Because Boston, she says to herself, is a place where you can find velvet. She once found velvet and thought that it was worth walking 1,000 miles for. Another doctoral dissertation could be done on the use female writers make of clothing, not as a status symbol, but as a vehicle of joy. Maxine Hong Kingston revels in the description of the different silk garments in her mother's ancestral trunk. Sea green, she calls them, eggplant purple, gold, the color of tiger's eyes. It was interesting, in my reading just these few weeks, I was reading two extremely different female writers, Ingeborg Bachmann, who is an Austrian writer, and Catherine Ann Porter, an American writer who wrote what I was reading in the 1920s. And both of them have page-long passages, which might attach to my particular shoe fetish. I mean, at least I'm more parochial about it, right? I always make it below the waist. They have page-long, joyous passages describing the pleasure of putting on clothes. Not for anybody, not to impress anybody, not to get anything, but they are descriptions of a woman alone putting on stockings, putting on dresses, polishing her nails, plucking her eyebrows, and feeling that this constitutes, in a very joyous way, the material self. That was just a little bit aside, partially inspired by you on the pleasure of female adornment as an aspect of realism in female fiction. That was sort of fun for me, just to talk about for a minute. And as Cyndi Lauper, one of the other important feminist writers, says in an equally important feminist text, girls just want to have fun. But let's return to Beloved. Having included the brutal violation and having endured, rather, brutal violation and dangerous childbirth, Sethe makes her way with her new baby, named Denver, after the white girl who wanted to walk to Boston for velvet, to the house of her mother-in-law, Baby Suggs, in Ohio, the free North. Baby Suggs is a combination lay preacher. She prays in a clearing in the woods, invoking not any sectarian religious God, but the power of her own life to comfort, to heal, and to inspire these runaway slaves who are living lives of such tremendous extremity. Her house is, in fact, a way station where runaway slaves can rest, eat, and be given, most particularly, shoes. So happy is Baby Suggs to have her daughter-in-law and her grandchildren safe with her that she plans an extravagant feast. Morrison writes page after page about the pleasures of the preparation and consumption of food. But in fact, the feast is a terrible turning point in the novel's action. The people in the black community, unused to abundance, begin to suspect and distrust Baby Suggs. They see in the very lavishness of the feast she offers, and all the pies and breads and roasted meats, a sign of pride. They begin to see her as not one of themselves, as apart from the community. So that when Setha's former owners, the very ones who raped her and took her milk, the milk from her breasts, arrive with the law on their side to reclaim Setha, their lost property, the black community does not warn baby Suggs of the presence of strange white people, which all of them know in itself is a danger. Setha sees her former owners, understands that they have come to take her and her children back to slavery, and she decides to kill herself and her children. She only gets as far, however, as sawing the head off her one-year-old baby before she is stopped. 20 years after this, a young woman arrives at the door with the same name as the murdered child, and this young woman is called Beloved. We never know who she is, or if she is a ghost or an ordinary human being. She seems to have information which no ordinary human being could have access to. But it doesn't matter. What the character of Beloved allows to happen is a deep and passionate search in this novel into the nature of maternal love and female identity, and the ways in which this identity is endangered and distorted by racism and sexism. We learn fascinating and terrible things about a slave woman's relationship to space and time. Her body is not hers. If her body is not hers, she will constitute space, time, the past, and the future in a way that are completely different from the ordinary bourgeois ways of constituting these very basic things. Now, it is certainly possible to say that by the conventions of what is known as realism, a novel in which a leading character may or may not be a ghost, and we're not sure, doesn't cut it. But Beloved gives us a deeply and finely textured portrait of the physical, emotional, spiritual, and even epistemological lives of characters, and it even gives us enormous insight into the present pathology of the black community, which is as real and dangerous a threat to the lives of both blacks and whites as anything in America. She gives us a portrait of real lives, of real black lives that we see as both different from and similar to our own in a way that makes Tom Wolfe's caricatures of pimps, addicts, and demagogues a pale, thin, third-rate joke, a thing of the moment whose value is anything but real. But now let's turn to sex. It seems to me that what passes for sexual realism among many male writers is anything but. The problem occurs because so many male writers haven't even got to the point yet of asking Freud's question, what do women want? And certainly they've never bothered to stay around to listen to the answer. Let's take the case of John Updike, who most people would agree is a realistic writer. Let's analyze what is thought of and passes for a realistic scene in one of his novels, Rabbit is Rich. Here's the situation. Harry, known as Rabbit Angstrom, having reached middle age and a somewhat firm place in the middle class as a result of a Toyota dealership, which is a gift from his father-in-law. And I must say, Updike is very good at that kind of class marker. So it's a perfect thing for your father-in-law to give you if you're trying to get into the middle class, a Toyota dealership. But Harry finds himself, poor fellow, in a strange sexual situation. He is on what will clearly be a wife-swapping vacation in the Caribbean with several other couples. One of the other men in his circle has married a rather yummy young woman whom Rabbit has been coveting throughout the whole novel. But in the lottery, which will decide who will share beds with whom for that particular night of wife swapping, Rabbit doesn't win his coveted Cindy. Instead, he gets Thelma, the unattractive, middle-aged schoolteacher wife of his old enemy. Thelma, it turns out, we discover, has been in love with Rabbit for about 20 years. She's ready to do anything, she tells him, to make him sexually happy. But she tells him there is no need for him to even consider having regular genital sex with her because she's menstruating, and menstrual blood is much too disgusting a thing for anyone so pure and wonderful and beautiful as Rabbit to even think about going near. She has a better idea for beautiful, pure, innocent Rabbit. She asks him to get into the bathtub so they can urinate on each other. Clearly, this is not too disgusting for someone as pure, beautiful, and innocent as Rabbit. After this, they have anal sex. And the delighted Rabbit's feelings are described, quote, he felt as if he were whispering, as if in prayer, unquote. I think he went to a different church from either you or me, I don't know. Rabbit seems to be having a wonderful time. Thelma seems to be having a wonderful time, giving Rabbit a wonderful time. What would constitute a wonderful time for Thelma, outside of giving Rabbit a wonderful time, is never suggested. But after all, we have to watch and listen to all this for many pages. Updike gives us what is to me a truly staggering display of unearned realism. And he says that, quote, having washed the ammoniac scent of urine off their skin, Rabbit watches through the louvers as the sun comes up on the morning of his one true marriage, unquote. Now, here is a problem. Realism is in the eye, ear, fingertips, taste buds, and nose of the beholder. To me, the psychological unreality of the scene in Rabbit is rich, and the unreal relationship between the language Updike uses and what it is meant to represent makes the question of realism and unreality most troubling. If what Updike tells us about women and their sexuality is realism, it's a reality that has no place for me and women like me. Realism is, as it is, has been defined by men, and it is so full of distortions and omissions, so replete with misconstructions of the world, so limited in that part of life which it includes, and so arrogant in the importance of what it leaves out, that as a definition in its present state, it is nearly useless for women. As more women write in various and varied styles, as more and more of women's stories find their way into the novels, as the empty places which marked the silenced voices and stories of women begin to be filled in, then and only then will we be able to even begin to talk about a realism that is real for more than half the human beings in the world. Thank you. Yes, the question was about my upbringing, particularly my religious upbringing. I was brought up in a community, a kind of community that has vanished off the face of the earth. I might as well have been, an Eskimo who went to school on the back of a sled dog or something. I mean, that's how gone it is. When I was brought up, and it was right outside New York City, in the 1950s, I literally, before I went to college, did not know any non-Catholics. I didn't know any. So, except the man who owned the little candy store was a Jew, and the dry cleaner was a Protestant.
Of course.
And so you would have, right. Well, you guys were good at that. We let you have it. We didn't want everything, we weren't that greedy. We were too busy setting fires in our backyard to clean our clothes. So you would have a conversation with a non-Catholic like, I'd like a chocolate soda, or please press those pants. But that was it. And people wouldn't say, where I was growing up, what town are you from? They'd say, what parish are you from? And the church, which was an Irish church, was very controlling of every aspect of everybody's life. And within that controlling aspect, my parents were particularly devout. My father was a Jew who converted. My father was I loved him very much, but I have a lot of problems with his politics. My father converted in the 30s because he supported Franco. He, if you understand T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound and their sort of right-wing, literary right-wing fantasies, that the Middle Ages, the age of faith was the great age, and that since the modern age was a disappointment and mediocre and run by money, that was how my father lived. He wanted to be in the 12th century. He really did. And he married my mother, who was a very simple woman, and he thought he was marrying, the peasant. So they had absolutely nothing in common except this very devout Catholicism that they shared. So from the larger social world to the daily life of my childhood, everything was saturated by the power of the church. And when I was a teenager, the Second Vatican Council took place. In 5 years, it was all gone. It was all gone. And it's quite a remarkable thing that something that was that powerful for that long dispersed so quickly.
And still all gone?
It's gone. It won't come back again.
Won't
come back again. Partly for reasons of class. It intersected with historical class movements in America, so that the Irish and Italian and Polish Catholics, who were largely working class and therefore kept to their own neighborhoods, moved into the middle class and moved into the larger framework of America. So those two things kind of happened at the same time, but it's over. It's completely over. Now the Catholic Church in America, probably demographically, is largely Hispanic, although it's still run by the Irish. But the shape of who's really in church, it's probably lower class Hispanics. But all the bishops are still Irish guys in their 70s, but they'll be dead soon. They really will be dead soon, and there's no young clergy. I mean, there's an enormous crisis. So I really, unless the church does something about changing its mind about male celibate clergy, they're simply they're gonna run out of these guys, because they all drink a lot, they eat a lot of red meat, and they're in their 70s. So, I just don't know what will happen, but it's certainly unrecognizable to what it was when I was growing up.
Do you feel any affinity with other Catholic writers, or more affinity with women writers, I think?
The only Catholic writer that I feel affinity with is Barnard.
Barnard,
the French writer.
But how do you think about Flannery O'Connor? Because
I think she's a very great writer, but I think we have absolutely nothing in common. She's very, first of all, she never writes about Catholics. No. She only writes about Protestants. Yeah. She's an ironist. She's a moralist of a severe stripe that I don't think that I am. She's much more pessimistic about human nature than I am. She's very interested in violence, which I am not. Mm-hmm.
But don't you think that Laura from Men and Angels, that has something in common with the Flannery O'Connor character? Yeah. But in the Flannery O'Connor book, Laura would have killed Anne and the children, and it's just the other way around.
Absolutely. And I couldn't have endured writing that.
Yeah. Well, I seem to be taken over the... Are there any other questions from the audience? Yeah?
Are you still devout?
Am I still devout? I don't know. I really don't know how to answer that.
Are your children baptized?
My children are baptized, yes. But that's not synonymous with being devout.
No, of course not. But
I guess my problem with the church is that the church in my fantasy, which has nothing to do with what is presided over by that guy in the Vatican, is a place where certain virtues exist. Virtues of committed, embodied, non-abstract love and responsibility. The church also owns some buildings in which many different kinds of human beings can be together. And if those buildings cease to exist, I don't know where human beings who otherwise have nothing in common can be in the same roof. And I think that's a big problem with the modern world. How can you get people out of their houses and away from their television sets so they talk to somebody else that is unlike them? And most of the world is unlike us now. So I'd be very reluctant to see the whole thing go. Although, as it is presided over by Carol Wojtyla, I certainly can't feel at home there.
And your husband, is he?
He's a Midwestern Protestant.
Ah.
Yes.
I'm there. Not as Catholics as you now at the moment in the United States. For instance, when I remember a few years ago, I was in San Francisco, and I saw, for instance, in a very traditional Catholic parish, how traditional Catholics, together with homosexuals, people, persons with AIDS, and so on, how together, and even communion was distributed by homosexual priests. This whole community was really, this has nothing to do with Carol Wojtyla, but this type of Catholics, they are still existing in the country.
Well, but Carol Wojtyla is cracking down on people more and more. And he's really read the riot act to American bishops and told them to crack down on things like that. For instance, Dignity, which is a gay rights group in New York, used to have a mass, and the cardinal forbade that. That's now illegal. There were protests. Dignity protested that in St. Patrick's Cathedral. Their protest consisted of standing up during the sermon rather than sitting down. And the cardinal reacted to that by sending in the cops and having them arrested in the middle of Mass. So it's getting harder and harder in America. And people are just losing patience. They just say, it's not worth it. It's not worth it anymore. What there is a big increase in is conservative Catholicism. So, for example, the only religious orders that still have young people going in are very right-wing, traditional. The nuns are garbed up to here. They still get candidates from the right wing. That seems to be the growth area, as we say. It's not a nice picture, I don't think.
May I ask you something about your latest book, The
Yes.
Other Side? One of the main characters, Ellen, I felt was the most intriguing person, but quite unsympathetic. Did you intend her to be so?
I didn't intend her to be likable, but I intended her to be lovable and admirable, because she was one of those immigrant women whom I saw a lot of, who had enormous energy and determination and courage. And then all that energy got put into a house. And it was as if you took a machine that was meant to build the Empire State Building and turned it into a vacuum cleaner. So there was this tremendous energy that should have looked outward that got turned inward to the home, and a lot of distortion took place. Nonetheless, I meant her to be a character I thought she was able to give love to her grandchildren. But it was just that domestic role that was so distorting of her real personality that it had terrible effects on her children. But I saw that a lot in that generation of immigrants. They were very tough. They had to be very tough to survive because life was very tough. And they didn't have a lot of softness left in them anymore. which she certainly didn't. Yes?
Yeah.
What you're saying now is like, I don't want to criticize you, but like from a feminist point of view, you say because they didn't have the ability to build the Empire State Building, they were turned into a bathroom cleaner. But if you take somebody who just arrived, a new immigrant, I would say there are lots of other things in it. And you said yourself how beautiful life was. So it's not, it seems to me that you're putting everything from a feministic point of view.
I saw more women than men, women of great imagination and energy. And often, particularly in these Irish families, the women had more emotional strength and even power in the family than the men did. And what I saw was that these women had so much energy and so much imagination, and they felt extremely. And my character, for example, had a political past. She was involved in the early labor movement. Right. And then she got married, and all that outward looking just stopped. She just stayed home. And I saw my grandmother be like that, and the grandmothers of other people that I knew. Women who early on came over, they were very fierce, they had real political interests, they were very involved in the labor movement or the early Democratic Party, and then they got married and they just stayed home, and they never went out again. And these women, I saw an enormous amount of anger, of a different type than the men had. That the men might have been frustrated at their work and kind of exhausted. But with these women, you felt this enormous untapped energy. And just anger at the narrow compass of, they wouldn't have said this about themselves. If you would ask my grandmother, did you want to go out and organize labor unions? She would have said, no, I have to take care of my kids. But I kept meeting these women, the tone of whose anger was very different from the men's anger. And you always got the sense that these women could have done fantastic things in the world. And sometimes when they were very, very old, they would say it. So I remember seeing a grandmother of a friend of mine when my friend actually decided to be a doctor. Her grandmother, who was then in her 80s and had been a traditional housewife, cried and said, you do it, because I never got to do it. But all her life before that, she would have said, of course I did what I had to do. So, yes, it's a feminist point, but I do think that not everybody is suited for domestic life. It's a vocation, the same as being a farmer is a vocation. You wouldn't put every man in the world on a farm. You shouldn't put every woman in the world in a house. It's something that takes a particular temperament. And I think if you don't have that temperament, an enormous amount of poisonous anger. I mean, listen to the way women scream at their children. It's shocking. It's really shocking. Perfectly nice women in supermarkets screaming. Screaming. Where does that come from? The women whom I know, like myself, I have 2 children, and women like me, we're very tired. We're a little bit crabby because usually our husbands don't help us enough. But we're not screaming at our children when they spill chocolate milk in the same way, like everything's at stake if there's a stain on the rug. So, yes, there are frustrations, and there is no perfect solution, and I don't think we've got it figured out. I don't think anybody's got it figured out. But that kind of shocking anger that women can turn in against the domestic situation, I think is misused energy, misplaced energy, and I find it quite frightening. I think there are some women who love to be at home. They love domestic life. They find it enjoyable and fulfilling. And I think that's fantastic. I think they should do it. I think God bless them. But I think it's a rare talent. And it's a talent. It's a certain set of skills and a certain, you have to like to be alone a lot. You have to like very repetitive work. You have to like things that are undone as soon as they're done. You have to like particular visual order. That has to be very important to you. That doesn't describe everybody in the world.
Describes me.
Yeah. Not me, though.
No.
In trying to explain the lack of Vietnam novels, you called the Vietnam War unknowable. But do you think it is more unknowable than, say, the First World War? Would you elaborate on that?
I think it is more unknowable than the First World War because first of all, the Europeans were fighting other Europeans. Their enemy was recognizable to them. And there were certain conventions that both sides accepted as they bayoneted each other. I mean, so all war is insane. But there was a way in which the First World War is the ultimate literary war, because you really felt, well, this is a clear enemy, and I know why I'm fighting this. I know why I'm fighting this enemy. I understand him. I understand his methods of fighting. They're familiar to me. I understand the terrain. The landscape is familiar to me. This is even quite an ancient enemy. I fought this guy before. In Vietnam, we didn't know why we were there. We didn't know if we should be there. As the war went on, many people at home were telling these boys that they shouldn't be there. The enemy was somebody completely alien to them. The terrain was completely alien to them. The method of fighting was completely alien, and a lot of them were stoned all the time. So it seems to me much more unknowable than the First World War.
I think that the rank and file in the fields of northern France didn't know what they were actually doing there.
But they thought they did. The whole idea of dying for your country was meaningful, whereas in the middle of what happened to these kids, they'd come from someplace in South Carolina believing that it was good to die for your country. And in the middle of their stay in Vietnam, suddenly occurred to them, what the hell am I doing this for? And so the fantasy which allows war to happen, which is that it is a noble thing to die for your country, kind of collapsed in the middle of these kids' lives. And they were saying, who am I fighting this for? For what land? What are the issues? And I think that happened in the First World War, even to the rank and file. There was a sustainable myth that went on.
The sustained war found in the war. I mean, it's the case that, for example, the British had to shoot a lot of their soldiers to keep the other in line, and on the German side and the Russians, they had sort of major revolutions breaking out in military ranks.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's something more to do with the way these wars have been reported and the way the information has actually got back home.
Mm-hmm.
Whether these myths were then subsequently sustainable, or as in the Vietnam case, simply not.
Also, we had television in Vietnam.
Yeah.
So you couldn't keep the myth going, because what you saw, you couldn't hide things in a way that they could before. So I'm sure it made everything even more unreal as it became oddly more real. It must have become more unreal for the people fighting it. But also I think drugs had a lot to do with the unreality. That really made it a different ballgame. And if you talk to anybody in Vietnam, it seems like everybody was stoned or drunk the whole time. I'm not sure there ever was a drug-fought war before that. I could be wrong, but... Yes?
There was also here a question here.
Yeah.
Maybe first that and then afterwards that. Yeah?
This is more related to the domestic one. I recently read a book of essays by women writers, American women writers, in which they talk about the place of their own children in their work as writers.
Mm.
And I found it very interesting that some of them seem to be writing in spite of the presence of the children. I think it was Alice Walker who said, it's okay to have one.
One, yeah, I know that one. I know that essay.
And then Toni Morrison she fed off the presence
Yeah.
of the children.
Yeah.
How would you?
I think I'm more in definitely in the Toni Morrison camp. But yes, I mean, absolutely, I find them an endless. It's not that I write about them, nor does Toni write about her kids either, but it's just you have a stake in life in a different way, I think, if you have children, and it's shaped for you almost ontologically differently, and they're fun, and they give you know about bodies in a different way. So I think I feel very fed by them, and I just like them so much that my life is more pleasurable, if busier.
So you think a writer need kids?
Excuse me?
You think a writer need kids? Or not? Needs.
I'm sorry?
A writer.
No. Writer doesn't need anything but a pen.
Well, but
I mean, most of the great writers in the world didn't have children.
yes. Oh, yes. Well,
It depends on what you want. I mean, I'm not going to say, gee, too bad Henry James didn't have kids. I mean, he could have written something really good. Poor Proust, if only. Poor Flaubert.
yes, but what was your answer to her? I heard something that I thought a writer has a stake in the world.
I do.
I do.
I
How
do.
you was just
But
talking for yourself.
just for myself.
I see.
Just for myself.
Yes. Okay. There was another, yeah?
I have a question. In relation to Updike, you talked about the problems male writers have in writing about female sexuality. Do you think that women writers have a similar or parallel problem writing about male sexuality, and do you think that might be a problem in your work?
I think that male critics think I have a problem with male sexuality, but I think they're wrong. And I don't think that female writers have as much problem talking about male sexuality because males talk so much about their own sexuality that we have a lot of information to go on. I mean, you don't even have to ask them. They're happy to tell you. It's hot news. Male sexuality, and males don't want to hear the real story about female sexuality, and also I think male sexuality is, to be somewhat purposely crude, simply more visible, and that makes it more. There's less secrecy about it. It's less. It's almost less complicated.
That's your idea.
I was wondering, the thesis she developed, what is Martin Hart thinking about her thesis on the realistic view of male writers?
No, I think what she said about Updike I agreed with. Yes. But, yeah.
Do you consider yourself as a typical male author?
I don't think so. Oh. Especially after the last Opzij, I don't think so.
Are there this type of authors in the United States like Martin Hart among all the Americans? Because
You mean some people who have a more sympathetic to the feminine consciousness? Sure.
you generalize a little bit too much.
They're not the most successful ones. The ones who have positions of power and win the prizes and get the money and sell the books don't.
But name names. I'm interested to know some of these guys I should be reading because I'm not in America very much. And I'm not.
David Plant is a wonderful writer. I'm trying to think who's good. I can think of English, actually William Trevor, who's in William Trevor, I think, is a wonderful, wonderful writer who is extremely sympathetic to to women. There's a very good Irish writer whose name has just gone out of my brain.
It will come back.
Uh,
You will if you don't try to think about him.
It's called Amongst Women is the title, and I believe his name is John McGahern or something.
Yeah,
Is that
John
right?
McGahern, yeah.
He's, I think, doing some very interesting work. Trying to think of other men. Anyway, I'll think of some others.
And while you're at it, how about other women writers that we're perhaps not hearing as much about?
Yeah, as I...
Morrison, of course, we know.
That was the other lecture we did.
Louise Erdrich, Maxine Hong Kingston, Marilyn Robinson, Ann Tyler. I don't know, I seem to have a hole in my brain at the moment, but that's sort of enough, right? Start. But I'm sure that Maxine Hung, I'm sure that Louise Erdrich sold 1/50th of what Tom Wolfe sold here.
But that's not the criterion.
It's the criterion for what you know of as American writing. So it's the criterion for what you know to look for in a bookstore next time. And I mean, no, it's not the criteria sub specie aeternitas, but it influences what gets put in people's hands in a very practical way.
The question.
Yes, I have a question about thinking about it. Lately, very much attention is drawn to the beauty myth. I don't know whether you...
I'm sorry?
The beauty myth.
The Beauty Myth by Caroline...
Bye.
No.
I can explain to you. Beauty myth
The beauty myth, I don't know it.
huge amount of, written to women that they have to be beautiful and slim and things like that.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you very well.
Okay, let's try to speak up. There is the demand that women have to be more beautiful. That
She thinks that's a good thing?
No.
Oh. Oh.
No.
around women in society.
Right.
Kind of invented by males. And then I read in your book, Final Famous, that at the end the main character is trying to become slim again, and it surprised me so because I thought, well, it kind of goes along with culture instead of being a kind of
Well, I think food and the way women abuse their bodies around the issue of food is a very complicated one for feminists as well. My character abused her body by overeating. And so it wasn't that she was eating because it was pleasurable or fun. She was overeating to punish herself. So that what she wanted to do was to get back to a more normal relationship to food. It's not like she went to take aerobics classes or start throwing up. But women can punish themselves with food in many different ways. I mean, I think it's very interesting that women use food as a weapon against themselves in a way that men don't. Girls die. Anorexia is a disease of females, as is bulimia. Something like 1% of anorexics are male. And I was telling Martin when I taught at Amherst, this was 10 years ago, there was such an epidemic of bulimia, which is, making yourself vomit after you eat so that you don't gain weight, that you could not go into the bathroom of the cafeteria after lunch because it stank. Because all these girls, legions of them, were making themselves vomit in order to be thin. Now, the boys weren't doing that. Males aren't threatening their health with operations that are going to kill them. But I do think that women can use food on themselves, whether overeating or starving themselves, as a punishment. And I think that's what my character was doing. She was always almost making herself inert by overeating.
Do you have a solution? Because what
None.
the rule says is that you just have to eat as much I didn't think that it was very realistic.
No, it's completely unrealistic. We would have to, I think that is the whole beauty issue is the issue which the women's movement has been least successful in touching. And that is because there is a billion-dollar industry devoted to making women feel unattractive and making them feel they have to buy. I remember I went to one of those counters where they sell makeup with a friend of mine one time, and I just wanted to buy an eyeliner, and this woman kept saying, "Oh my God, look at the rings under your eyes, and look at the wrinkles, and do this to your eyebrows, and do that." And my friend was with me. She kept saying, this one kept saying, "Oh, this is really awful, what's happened to you?" And I had a male friend with me, and he said, "And you know what the tragedy of this woman is? She's only 17 years old." But their whole approach to selling me $200 worth of cosmetics was I had to feel that without them I couldn't walk on the street without a paper bag over my head. Well, it's connected to money. So until we broke that connection, until it stopped being an industry, I don't see how we break the connection. I feel quite hopeless about it, if you'd like to know. Hopeless. No, not really. I think that actually there is a kind of healthy narcissism, and women can take pleasure in how they look, and it's a form of play. When it ceases to be a form of play, and when you feel like somebody's holding a gun to your head, then you know you've got to step back and start being playful about it again. But I think it's a very, very, very painful issue. A friend of mine said, if somebody told me I won, Toni Morrison actually said to me once, if somebody told me I won the Nobel Prize, my first two thoughts would be, what will I wear and how can I lose 10 pounds before Stockholm? Now, I'm sure Saul Bellow didn't start eating grapefruit.
No, but,
what can we do?
Maybe he was also thinking, what shall I wear?
But he could answer that very quickly. Wear the blue suit, Saul. It'll look good. Yes.
What interests me is exactly upbringing and being a female. I'll tell you two things, and I'd like to react to that. I think that we should write stories, imaginary, subconscious stories, to explore a female reality in which I can identify myself, or I can't identify myself right now in the religion, in the Catholic, in the Bible, in everything. I think we should write new stories like the Bible or Greek myths.
New myths.
So I think realism is not a good vehicle.
Mm-hmm.
Second, I think we should study man on a very realistic way.
Mean man the gender or man the species?
I think we should write a portraits
Portraits.
of man, of the patriarch, to begin with, to get these flaws down. I would like to react to that.
Sounds like a great enterprise. I think it's good.
Your vehicle is realism.
For now, I say that we should do all sorts of things. And I think that it's a very large enterprise. It's that we are all involved in the business of trying to figure out what it is to be alive and describe that. And I think there are many, many different ways to do it. I'm very nervous about prescribing we should all do this or we should not do that. I think we should all do everything. And what you're doing sounds like a very exciting new way of doing it. It's probably not anything I'm gifted for. But I can see how your doing that would really open up the conversation in exciting new ways.
Well, then another question. Is one of your issues the role of the daughter and the independent young woman? I think
Yes.
that is denied in Catholicism, and I think it should have a new position.
It's denied everywhere. I don't think it's unique to Catholicism. Nobody wants women to be independent. I think, oddly enough, Catholicism, because it had the figure of the nun, oddly enough gave women an out that other traditions didn't. That you didn't have to marry in order to have a life. And so it was almost like the nuns took over the Athena role or the Diana role. That they were living, they were honored, they were sacred, but they weren't connected to men. And they lived with each other and in terms of each other. Now, I mean, their power was very limited, and it always ultimately had to defer to the patriarch. I'm not saying that it didn't. But compared to other traditions, it seems to me in other traditions there was no image near to hand of the woman who was honored without being attached to a man. So that's why I think you find in for example, in American feminism, the number of Catholic women far outweighs their proportion in the national population. Because I think that figure of the nun, which you worked either against or in terms of, was at least a strong female image, not connected to men. But I think nobody wants women to be independent. Men hate that. Women are afraid of it. It's the most difficult thing. So I think it just goes across the whole world and the whole species. I think we have to create, what I'm interested in is creating new metaphors and new romances for the woman alone. For example, we have in film noir, right? There's always the man in the raincoat walking down the city street at the end. It's a romantic image. The cowboy on the horse goes off by himself. The mountain climber climbs up the mountain by himself. If we see a solitary woman, what do we think? She's going to get raped. We think of Amelia Earhart. Oh, look what happened to her. I think we need to create new romances of and shimmering metaphors for the woman on her own.
Okay, maybe that's a good point to stop now the discussion. We can go further on in the little rooms in this nice building.
Well, is this going? No. It's not working.
Yeah.
Yes, it's
Yes, it
working. All
works.
right. Well, first of all, I want to thank you, Mrs. Gordon. It was a great lecture. It was a nice discussion. Mr. Hart, also, thank you very much for leading the discussion and getting the audience enthusiastic. Actually, I would like to do one thing on behalf of the board, is having this sort of wooden stick with a piece of velvet at the end, like in church, and go and get some money for our institute. That's what worries us. So I hope that we all can count on you someday for our institute. And I hope you all will come on the 6th of June, because then Mr. Paul Watkins will come here, a very promising new writer. And thank you for listening to us, and I hope you can stay for a little wine and have some more of conversation with our guests. Thank you.
Thank you.